Story 1: The Night Shift Nightmare. My name is Stella, and I want to share with you the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started when I began working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, a quaint medical center in the small town of Elmswood. Little did I know, those nights would turn into a living nightmare that would haunt me forever. I was 26 years old, fresh out of nursing school, and eager to prove myself. The night shifts were tough, but I enjoyed the quietness of the hospital at night. My colleagues were friendly, and I quickly formed a bond with Sarah, a fellow nurse, and Mike, a security guard who was always up for a chat during our breaks. One particularly chilly night, around 2 a.m., I decided to step outside for some fresh air. As I leaned against the cold brick wall, savoring the crisp night breeze, I noticed a man in a hooded jacket standing across the street. At first, I thought he was just a passerby, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, staring in my direction, sent a chill down my spine. I brushed it off as paranoia and went back inside. Over the next few nights, I started seeing him more frequently, always in the same spot, always watching. I mentioned it to Mike, who promised to keep an eye out. "Don't worry, Stella. It's probably just some guy waiting for a ride," Mike said, though his eyes betrayed a hint of concern. But the man's presence became more unsettling. One night, as I walked to my car after my shift, I saw him standing closer, almost in the middle of the parking lot. His face was partially obscured by the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, and hurriedly unlocked my car. As I drove away, I could see him in the rearview mirror, still watching. The next day, I found a note under my windshield wiper. It read, "I see you." My hands trembled as I held the paper. I reported it to hospital security, and they assured me they would increase their patrols. Despite their efforts, the man continued to appear every night, and the notes became more personal, mentioning details about my life that he shouldn't know. I started receiving text messages from an unknown number, saying things like, "Nice dress today," or "Hope you enjoyed your coffee." I changed my number, but the messages kept coming. It was as if he was always one step ahead. Sarah noticed my anxiety and suggested I stay with her for a while. I agreed, grateful for her support. Her apartment was on the other side of town, and I hoped the man would lose interest if I wasn't following my usual routine. One evening, my shift ended earlier than usual. As I headed to my car, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around and there he was, closer than ever before, a sinister grin on his face. I froze, paralyzed with fear. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to stammer. He didn't respond, just kept grinning. I ran to my car, but he followed, pounding on the windows as I fumbled with the keys. Miraculously, I managed to start the car and drive away. My heart raced as I sped through the empty streets, not daring to look back. I decided to stay with Sarah permanently until the situation was resolved. The next morning, Sarah and I went to the police. They took my report and promised to investigate, but I could tell they were skeptical. Days passed, and I heard nothing from the police. Then, one night at Sarah's apartment, we heard a knock on the door. It was Mike. He looked worried. "Stella, I need to talk to you," he said, glancing around nervously. "I did some digging on my own. The guy you described matches the profile of a former patient named David. He was discharged a few months ago after undergoing treatment for severe paranoia and delusions. He became obsessed with one of the nurses who looked a lot like you." My blood ran cold. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mike sighed. "The hospital tried to keep it quiet. They didn't want to scare the staff or patients. That night, we barricaded the door and stayed up, too frightened to sleep. I felt trapped, like a prey being hunted." The next morning, I received another note, this time slipped under Sarah's door. "You can't hide from me." We called the police again, but they seemed reluctant to act. Frustrated and scared, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up a hidden camera in Sarah's apartment, hoping to catch David in the act. A few nights later, around midnight, I heard a noise outside the window. Sarah and I watched the footage from the hidden camera. It showed a shadowy figure outside, staring in. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the stalker was gone. The police finally started taking us seriously and launched a full investigation. Weeks of fear and sleepless nights passed. Every creak, every shadow made my heart race. I was constantly on edge, waiting for David to strike. Then one evening I received a call from the police. They had caught David. He had been lurking around Sarah's apartment, and when they confronted him, he confessed to everything. He had been following me for months, driven by his delusions. I thought the nightmare was over, but it wasn't. The trauma lingered. I moved back to my own apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed my routine, stayed off social media, and even adopted a dog for protection. Months later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. It was a photograph of me, taken from a distance, with the words, "Always watching," written on the back. I contacted the police, but they couldn't trace it. I decided to move to a different city, hoping to leave the terror behind. The first few weeks were peaceful, but one night, as I walked home from my new job, I saw a familiar figure standing under a streetlight, watching me. I hurried past, my heart pounding. When I glanced back, he was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a remnant of the fear that had haunted me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The nightmare was far from over. David was still out there, and he would never stop. And so, every night, as I lock my doors and windows, I can't help but wonder if tonight will be the night he finds me again. The fear has become a part of me, a constant reminder that in the shadows, someone is always watching.
Story 2. The Social Media Shadow. My name is Samantha, and today I want to share a chilling experience that forever changed how I view the online world. It started out as a typical college adventure, full of selfies, hashtags, and daily updates. But it quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. I was 22, a college student at Greenfield University, and like many people my age, I loved sharing my life on social media. I posted pictures, updates, and live streams almost daily. My followers were a mix of friends, family, and a growing number of strangers who seemed interested in my life. I never thought much about the dangers of oversharing until it was too late. It all began when I noticed a user named JohnDoe123 commenting on all my posts. At first, his comments were innocuous enough. Compliments on my outfits, encouragements during exam weeks, typical fan stuff. But then, his comments became more frequent and personal. He mentioned knowing my favorite coffee shop, the exact time I went for my morning runs, and even the classes I attended. "Great job on your psychology exam," one comment read just hours after I had finished the test. I started feeling uneasy. How did he know these details? I shrugged it off, telling myself that maybe I had just mentioned these things in passing online. But then I received a direct message from him. "You looked stressed today. Hope you're okay." I hadn't posted anything about feeling stressed that day, but I had been. That was the first real chill that ran down my spine. I blocked JohnDoe123, thinking that would be the end of it. But within a day, a new account with a similar name started following me and commenting on my posts again. I blocked that one too, but more kept popping up. It was like playing a game of whack-a-mole, and I couldn't keep up. One night, while live streaming from my apartment, I was chatting with my followers about an upcoming trip I was planning. The usual friendly comments were rolling in, and I felt at ease. Then out of nowhere, a comment appeared. "Nice pajamas." My heart skipped a beat. I was wearing pajamas, but I hadn't shown them on camera. I ended the stream abruptly, feeling a surge of panic. I double-checked that all my windows were closed and locked. I told myself it was just a lucky guess, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The next day, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a doll, eerily similar to me, down to the clothes I had worn in a recent photo. There was a note, too. "We will be together soon." Terrified, I showed the package to my roommate, Jess. She suggested we go to campus security. They listened to my story but seemed skeptical. "Stalking cases can be tricky," Officer Miller said. "We'll keep an eye out, but without more evidence, there's not much we can do." Feeling helpless, I decided to lay low for a while. I stopped posting on social media and stayed off my usual routes. Jess and I even switched rooms, hoping it would help me feel safer. But the feeling of being watched never left me. A week later, Jess and I decided to go out for a night to clear our heads. We went to our favorite bar, the Green Lantern, hoping to relax. But halfway through the night, I received another message from John Doe 123. Having fun at the Green Lantern? My blood ran cold. I looked around the bar, trying to spot anyone suspicious, but everyone seemed engrossed in their own worlds. I showed the message to Jess, and we decided to leave immediately. As we walked back to our apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. We quickened our pace, and by the time we got home, we were practically running. Once inside, we bolted the door and called the police. They heard us out and started an investigation, but without knowing the identity of John Doe 123, there wasn't much they could do immediately. They advised us to stay vigilant and keep a record of any more incidents. For a few days, things were quiet. I started to think that maybe the worst was over. But then, one night, as Jess and I were watching a movie, we heard a noise outside our window. We froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. Slowly, we crept to the window and peeked out. There, in the dim light of the street lamp, was a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, staring up at our window. Jess grabbed her phone and called the police while I took a photo of the figure. The figure seemed to notice and vanished into the darkness. The police arrived quickly, but the figure was long gone. They took our statements and the photo, promising to increase patrols around our building. They also suggested we stay with friends or family for a while, just to be safe. I decided to go home for the weekend. My parents lived in a small town a few hours away, and I thought some time away from the city would help. Jess stayed with her boyfriend, Mark, who lived off campus. The first night at home was the best sleep I'd had in weeks, but the second night, I woke up to a tapping sound on my window. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Slowly, I approached the window and peeked out. There he was, standing in my parents' backyard, staring up at me. It was John Doe 123. He smiled, a creepy, twisted smile, and held up his phone, showing that he was live streaming. I screamed and ran to my parents' room. My dad called the police while my mom tried to calm me down. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the yard, the stalker was gone. The police took the threat seriously this time. They placed our house under surveillance and started tracing the live stream. They discovered it was being broadcast from an anonymous account, but they managed to track the IP address to a nearby location. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see that twisted smile again. In the early hours of the morning, the police called. They had found and arrested the stalker. He was a former student of Greenfield University named Peter Harris. He had been expelled a year before for harassment but had stayed in town, fixating on me through my social media posts. I thought the nightmare was finally over. Peter was charged and sentenced, and I started to rebuild my life. I deleted all my social media accounts and became much more private. But a few months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of me taken from a distance with the words, "Always watching," written on the back. I contacted the police, but they couldn't trace it. I decided to move to a different city, hoping to leave the terror behind. I found a new job and a new apartment, trying to start fresh. For a while, everything was peaceful. I started to believe that maybe I could finally put this behind me. Then, one evening, as I walked home from work, I noticed a familiar figure standing under a streetlight, watching me. My heart pounded as I hurried past, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I glanced back, the figure was gone. Now, every night, as I lock my doors and windows, I can't help but wonder if tonight will be the night he finds me again. The fear has become a part of me, a constant reminder that in the shadows, someone is always watching. The nightmare never truly ended, it just took on a new form. And as I sit here, sharing my story, I know that somewhere out there he is still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike.
Story 3. The Hiker's Horror. Hi, I'm Rachel, and what I'm about to share with you is a real-life experience that I still have nightmares about. It all started on a hiking trip that was supposed to be a peaceful escape into nature, but it turned into something I could never have imagined. I was 25 and living in Seattle, working a stressful job as a marketing executive. To unwind, I decided to take a weekend off and go hiking in the Olympic National Park. I had always loved hiking. It was my way of disconnecting from the chaos and reconnecting with myself. My friend Mark, who was an avid hiker, suggested we explore a less-traveled trail known as the Lost Creek Loop. It was known for its dense forests and breathtaking views. Mark and I set out early Saturday morning, eager for the adventure. The first few hours were perfect. We laughed, took pictures, and marveled at the beauty around us. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trail became narrower and more secluded. The canopy above was so thick that it blocked out most of the sunlight, casting an eerie gloom. Around noon, we decided to take a break near a small, crystal-clear creek. While we ate our sandwiches, Mark mentioned an old local legend about a hiker who had vanished in these woods years ago. They say his spirit still roams the trails, lost and looking for a way out, Mark said with a grin, trying to spook me. I laughed it off, but a shiver ran down my spine. There was something unsettling about the dense, quiet forest. After our break, we continued on the trail, which seemed to grow more twisted and confusing. Mark, usually confident in his navigation skills, started to look worried. I swear this trail should be heading north, but my compass says otherwise, he muttered, frowning at the map. As the day wore on, we realized we were hopelessly lost. Panic began to set in as the light started to fade. We decided to set up camp for the night and try to find our way back in the morning. We pitched our tent in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, ominous trees. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with strange noises. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. We sat by the campfire, trying to stay calm. Mark's usual humor was gone, replaced by a tense silence. Around midnight, just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard a faint whisper. I sat up, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark, who was staring into the fire. "Hear what?" he replied, his voice shaky. "I thought I heard someone whispering." Mark shook his head. "It's just the wind, Rachel. Try to get some sleep." But sleep was impossible. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the trees. I was terrified, but Mark insisted it was just my imagination. Around 3 a.m., Mark said he needed to step away for a moment. He grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the trees. Minutes passed, then an hour, and he still hadn't returned. I called out for him, but there was no answer. My panic grew as I realized I was alone in the dark, eerie forest. Desperate, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured out to look for him. The whispering grew louder, almost like it was guiding me. I followed the sound until I reached a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was Mark's flashlight, lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Mark. I ran back to the camp and waited until dawn, terrified and alone. As soon as it was light, I packed up and started retracing our steps, hoping to find a way back to the main trail. Hours later, exhausted and scared, I stumbled upon a group of park rangers. They took me back to their station and listened to my story. They organized a search party and combed the area where I had last seen Mark, but there was no trace of him. Days turned into weeks, and the search was eventually called off. Mark was officially listed as missing. Haunted by guilt and fear, I tried to move on with my life, but strange things kept happening. I would see glimpses of Mark in crowded places, only for him to vanish when I got closer. At night, I heard the same whispering that had plagued me in the forest. Desperate for answers, I returned to Olympic National Park with a new group of rangers, determined to find out what had happened to Mark. Among them was Ranger Tom, a seasoned veteran who had heard his share of spooky stories. We set up camp near the same creek Mark and I had stopped at, and as night fell, the whispering began again. The rangers looked uneasy, but tried to rationalize the noises. Tom, however, seemed more intrigued than frightened. Around midnight, we heard footsteps approaching our camp. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, and there he was, Mark, standing at the edge of the clearing, looking exactly as he had the night he disappeared. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with empty eyes. The rangers shone their lights on him, but in the next moment, he was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him. The next day, Ranger Tom decided to stay behind with me while the others continued searching. He believed there was something supernatural at play. That night, as we sat by the campfire, the whispering began again. This time, Tom heard it too. "Rachel, there's something out here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen anything like this." As the whispering grew louder, Tom's face paled. "Do you hear that? It sounds like it's calling your name." I nodded, terrified. "It always does." Suddenly the fire went out, plunging us into darkness. We heard footsteps circling the camp, and then a scream. It was one of the rangers who had gone out to search. Tom grabbed his flashlight and we ran towards the sound. We found the ranger, Dave, on the ground, gasping for breath. "I saw him," he choked out. "I saw Mark, but when I tried to follow him, I felt something cold." We helped Dave back to the camp, but he was badly shaken. He kept muttering about seeing shadows and feeling an icy grip. Tom and I decided it was too dangerous to stay. We packed up and made our way back to the main trail, supporting Dave between us. As we neared the park's edge, I saw Mark again, standing just off the trail. I stopped, my heart pounding. "Mark, please," I begged. "What do you want?" He just stared at me. And then he whispered, "Help me." In that moment, I realized that Mark was not alive. He was a ghost, trapped in the forest. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We needed to get out now. We broke into a run, but the forest seemed to come alive around us, whispering and rustling. Dave collapsed, unable to go on. Tom and I dragged him the rest of the way, but by the time we reached the park ranger station, Dave was unconscious. The paramedics arrived and took Dave to the hospital, but he never recovered. He passed away the next day, his body unable to cope with the terror and the cold he had felt. The rangers conducted a full investigation, but found no logical explanation for what had happened. They closed off the Lost Creek Loop, declaring it too dangerous. I moved away from Seattle, trying to escape the memories. But even now, years later, I still hear the whispering at night. And sometimes, I see Mark's face in the shadows. The forest took him, and it almost took me too. But the true horror is knowing that some things can never be explained, and some spirits never find peace.